Hello there. I'm Kurt Steinbrueck, pastor of Faith Lutheran Church, and we are going through the book of Romans in this video series here. And I'm glad that you've joined us for today's video. So we've gone through all the way through Romans 1 through 12. We're now entering Romans 13 today. And if you'd like to see any of those videos, you can catch our previous Romans videos on our YouTube channel, which is Faith Lutheran Church Wesley Chapel YouTube channel. Or you can go to our website at faithwesleychapel.com and you can find them in our blog, as well as other series that we've done and devotions and things like that. All right, so today we're going to be talking about governments, which is one of the big topics of Romans 13. But before we do that, let's take a moment to pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the grace and mercy that you show us each and every day. We thank you for the salvation that you have brought us through Jesus Christ, and that it's a gift. We can't earn it. We couldn't earn it, even if we could try. Lord, help us to trust you. Help us to believe, to have faith in you. And Lord, as we read your word, we pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to understand it and believe it, and to be changed by it. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're going to read, this is Romans 13, 1 to 10, which is longer than we normally do, though not longer than most of our Saturday videos, which is what this is. And the reason is because we are using the readings that we have for the church year. And this is the intent of our Saturdays, not only to talk about whatever it is that we're dealing with in Romans, but to prepare ourselves for worship for Sunday. So we'll read through this whole passage, and then we'll talk about governments and economies in the Bible. But of course, if you're in the area, the Wesley Chapel area, we'd love to have you come worship with us tomorrow, or whatever day it might be the next Sunday for you if you're catching this at a different time. We meet at 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And if you go to our website, faithwesleychapel.com, you can find out all the information you need about attending. All right, so let's read this here. Romans 13, 1 to 10. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, so today we're going to kind of be using this more as a jumping off point. It's talking about submitting to governments, to the authorities that God has established. And there's all kinds of questions that come up with that. And it's, of course, even just it's not necessarily a difficult concept to understand per se, but it's a difficult one to do in practice, right? But today I want to focus more on, is there a specific kind of government that the Bible indicates we should have, or a specific kind of economy that the Bible indicates that we should have? Because the two kind of go hand in hand. So just to lay it out there from the beginning here, the simple answer is this. The New Testament does not endorse any specific kind of government or kind of economy. Right? However, it does affirm the goodness of government in general. Okay, so government is good because it has purpose, which we saw here is to praise those who do good and to punish those who do evil. So government is good. It brings order and peace, at least when it's done properly. Of course, people are corrupt, people are sinners, and so it's not always done properly. Just like, you know, something God has established for us, it may not be used properly. Just like God has given us the senses that we have, and we don't always use those appropriately either. So what people do with it, that's one thing. But the fact that we have these governments is here for our good order and peace and benefit. Now, so the Old Testament doesn't prescribe any specific kind of government or economics. The Old Testament, it does tell us about a government, Israel, right? And we can look at that government structure and maybe glean some principles from it, but we need to be very, very careful when we do that. Only Israel was Israel. Okay. Only Israel was Israel. And so just because God gave certain laws and systems to Israel does not mean that different laws or systems are necessarily bad. So we may say, well, the laws and systems that God gave are probably good. They were certainly good for the people of Israel, but they may not all be good or apply to us today. There's holiness laws and all these kinds of things. But even the ones that are more about governing the people, we need to remember that there may be other laws and other ways of doing things that are also good or can be good at least. So neither the Old nor the New Testament prescribe a government or an economic system. So what do we see though in the Old Testament? What kind of a government did we see for Israel specifically? So Israel at times was a theocracy. Okay, a theocracy is when it's a country is being run by the priestly order of whatever the religion is of the country. And so at times they were a theocracy, at other times they were a monarchy, and at sometimes a combination. Sometimes they were they had nothing really. And so what do we see happen with that? Well, neither the theocracy nor the monarchy was perfect. There are times when this goes pretty well. So you think about when David was king, the monarchy went pretty well, though it still had its issues. When certain judges were brought up as the kind of more theocratic type of government, then there were times when that went well. But there's also times when it did not go well. King Ahab, he was a monarch. That did not go well for the people of Israel. The nation suffered under him because he had turned away from God. We also have the priests or the Midian's false prophets, and they had to be dealt with because in this theocratic manner, they were misleading the people. So it seems like the primary determining factor of whether the king or the ruling priests, whether that was a good thing for Israel or not, seems to be mostly about whether they truly loved and followed God. So it really wasn't about the form of government. It was is the leadership, do they love God and are they following God's ways and are they leading the people in that, or are they maybe leading the people astray and not following God's ways? So when they followed God's ways, things went well. When they didn't, things went poorly. So God establishes government for the good of people. That's what it's talking about here in Romans 13. God establishes governments for the good of people, but no government is perfect. Why is that? Well, it's run by people, and people are not perfect. So people are sinners. We get selfish, and we don't always know the best thing to do. So we're kind of making guesses at times. But here's the thing: the lack of government would be much worse Okay, and that would be anarchy, right? That's chaos, and that's what we see in Judges, um, it, in alternating fashion. So I mentioned before, judges, like God would raise up judges, and then things would kind of get back in order for a little while, but then the people would fall away, and they would turn away from God, and they would have nobody that they were following after that judge uh, died, usually. And so we have that statement in Judges that the people had no king and everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. So this was essentially a um, an anarchy that was going on, and it's just terrible. If you read through the book of Romans, it just gets worse and worse and worse. So that's bad. But having some government to establish order, that's good. And so that's why God establishes government for our benefit, for our peace, for to punish evil and to reward good. And so as such, the people in the government, they should obey God's commands. They should, as should all people, right? And where they fail to do so, corruption starts to appear. Now, that's not to say that every government has to be a Christian government or only runs by Christians. That'd probably be the best. It would still have its flaws because Christians are sinners too. But we see even in the Bible, God using governments that are, people who have false gods and are not the people of God, and he still establishes those governments and uses them for his purposes. The primary purpose of a government is, at least from what we see here in Romans 13, is to punish evil behavior and to praise good behavior. Not that the government can't do other things, but it should at least be doing that. And then, of course, as we've seen, that whether the theocracy or the monarchy of Israel went well was primarily about whether the leaders were following God and leading the nation towards God, or whether they were doing the opposite. And so the government should not be leading people away from God, nor should it prevent people from worshiping or serving God. And if it does, then Christians need to obey God rather than man, which is part of what we'll be talking about later on Sunday morning. All right, so what about economies? Okay, so there's no official government in the Bible. What about economies? Because economies are unavoidable, right? We have to have some way of obtaining the things that we need to survive. So some idea of an economic situation or an economic system has to exist for people to be able to survive, even if it's like, hey, you're on your own and you've got to figure it out. Well, that's an economic form, right? Okay, everyone's just on their own. You got to make do with whatever you can get for yourself. When people are not able to obtain everything that they need on their own, then all of a sudden the economy becomes more complex. We start to have to trade and somehow have some means of getting what you need from outside of yourself. And then, that could be supply from the community. It could be trade. It could be theft. I mean, there's all different kinds of ways you could do that. Whatever you can think of for that, it would be a form of economy, not necessarily a good one, but it's a form. And then when society becomes or reaches a point where it's wealthy enough to meet the immediate needs of the people, now all of a sudden you have people who want things that they don't necessarily need. Like, I like having this phone. I don't actually need it to live, but I like having. So you have things like this that, where we don't really need them to live, but we want them for whatever reason. Maybe it's helpful for us or whatever. So then the economy becomes even more complex, right? And now we have to figure out, how do we exchange things? How do we somehow get the things that we want and things that we need and all this kind of stuff, right? So when God established Israel as a nation, he had to address the economy. And there were many laws that dealt with the economy. Even you can think about some of those big laws, in the 10 Commandments, like do not steal, right? Well, that's an economic rule. It's for the benefit of the people, that you're not taking their goods and services and things like that. So that's setting some boundaries there. That's establishing some economics. And there were other laws that that were given that were economically related. So these require an economy where the individual at least has their own property for themselves. That even though everything was ultimately seen as God's, people owned their own property. They could exchange, to some extent, they could exchange goods and services and things like that amongst each other. So there were laws about fairness. This demonstrates that trade was allowed, but fraud and corruption were not. They were to be punished. So it talks about how the weights were supposed to be fair weights and all this kind of stuff. So those were economic laws that God gave. There were taxes. This required people to give to the government in order to support the government. We still, of course, have taxes today. In Deuteronomy, we see that the people were commanded to care for the poor and those who are in need. However, it's interesting that the onus is given to the people, not necessarily to the government. So let me share this with you. Yep. All right, so this is Deuteronomy, and we're not going to read through all of this because there's quite a bit, but in Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 11, we have a sabbatical year. Okay, so you may have heard of the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is, the Saturday of every week. The people were to rest on the Sabbath, and they were to worship, but they weren't supposed to work, and it was a day of rest for people. Well, there was also a Sabbath year. So every seventh year, there was to be a Sabbath year where there was a release of, they were supposed to let their lands rest. They were supposed to what is it? So if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord has given you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against their poor brother, but you shall open up your hand to him and lend him sufficient for what he needs, whatever that may be. Take care lest there be unworthy thought in your heart that says, oh, the seventh year is near, and your eye is looking grudgingly on your poor brother. So what would happen is on the seventh year, they would release debts so that the people who were poor and suffering and in debt would be freed from that. And they would be brought out of that poverty and that debt. And so here it's also saying, hey, you can't go, okay, well, you know what, next year is the seventh year. So I'm not going to lend you the money because I know that it just gets forgiven next year, and that's not good for me. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to care for those who are in need. All right, so we have that. We have the sabbatical year. You have when you're finished paying the tithe of your produce in the third year, which is the year of tithing, give it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your town and be filled. So again, we see care for those who are in need. You had the laws about not completely harvesting everything out of your property. You were supposed to leave like the edges and allow people to glean, which is to walk through the field and be able to kind of pick their own harvest from there. And so again, you're allowing people who don't have, the poor, the sojourner, which would be someone who's from another country coming in, that they have some means of being able to eat and to provide for themselves. But again, these are laws that are given for the people to do, not necessarily for the nation to do. The onus is usually on the person. We also we have in Proverbs, we have a lot of wisdom that's given that is economically related. So if it oppresses the poor man, or actually this is, sorry, I'm going to get to the wisdom about economy in a second. This is more about that government concept. So here it does talk about oppression and things like that. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but whoever is generous to the needy honors him. Whoever mocks the poor insults his maker. Whoever is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord. He will repay him for his deed. So it talks about we should not oppress the poor. We should not prevent people from being able to survive and be able to even thrive. And again, We should be generous with each other. So the implication is that you shouldn't prevent someone, the government should not prevent someone from being able to provide themselves or prevent individuals from caring for those who are in need. Then we get to Proverbs. This is a multitude of these, but these are, we don't have to go through all these. But you can see like wealth that's gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase. All who toil, there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. So the importance of actually getting out of bed and going to work. The worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. We have some need, it gets us out of bed, right? We go do it. And we could see just over and over, there's a lot of economic wisdom here that would be good for you to just to know. But again, it's focused on what? It's focused on the person. So Proverbs, it doesn't have any economic laws, but it does give us some wisdom for that. And it's focused on the person. The last thing that I was going to bring up then is that there was also a year of Jubilee that was supposed to happen. Doesn't seem like it ever actually happened. But the idea was just like that 7-year Sabbath, the Sabbath year, after 49 years, so 7 sevens, that 50th year was supposed to be a year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, everyone rested, and all the debts were forgiven, property was returned, and all this kind of stuff. And the idea was that, to bring people out of poverty, to prevent families or tribes from having lost land permanently, that they could regain that land. And it also then prevents any one tribe from kind of taking over all the other tribes. Every 50 years, it would have to go back. Now, like I said, we're not, doesn't seem like that was ever actually done, but it was something that God gave for them to do. And unfortunately, they were disobedient with that. So those are all things that were given to Israel, and we can take some principles from those. But again, it's not establishing an economy that a government needs to follow. And so many of these economic rules or laws are focused on the individual and their responsibility to pay taxes or to care for the poor and things like that. It's not setting up a system of government that does that necessarily. That could be a choice, but that's not what was happening in Israel. They were basically telling the people that they need to care for the poor, which of course we see throughout the New Testament as well, that we're supposed to care for the poor. That's a personal thing. That's one of the challenges with having that. The further away we get that, or that goes from us, whether it's through a private entity or a government entity to take care of the poor, the less we actually are involved in that. And that affects us and our heart and our ability to do what we're supposed to do and to love others and to care for others in that way, to really get involved. And so we have to be careful, whether it's government or private or whatever. We should be personally involved with helping those who are in need. All right. So every time economics has come up in a conversation for me regarding what the church, or not what the church, what the government should be doing, I usually hear somebody bring up Acts 2, right? Acts 2, which talks about everyone giving towards kind of the common good and all of this. So let's take a look at Acts 2 and whether this is establishing a form of economics for us or whether it's something else. Let me share this with you. All right, so this is Acts 2, 42 to 47. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. All right, so does this describe a an economic system kind of, and I want to think about this in terms of a national economic system? And the answer is that it doesn't. Okay. So first, this describes what the church did initially. It's not a prescription. It's not saying this is what you must do, but rather this is what they did. And it doesn't actually even seem to have lasted very long. In fact, later on in Second Thessalonians, we see this. I should have stopped my share. Let me bring this back here real quick. In Second Thessalonians, it says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Okay, so what had happened, from what we can see with this line, is that there were people who they were taking advantage of the generosity of others, and just perfectly able-bodied people choosing not to work, and then live off of what other people were contributing to the body. And so that abuse was taking place. And Paul said, even when I was with you, and I'll give it to you again here in this letter, if people aren't working, then they don't get to eat. In other words, you don't get to take advantage of this. Get off your rear end if you can do it, and go work. We want to care for those who are in need, who cannot provide for themselves. But if you can provide for yourself, you need to do it. So that's the first thing. First thing is that this is showing what they did, not necessarily prescribing this as what we should do. And it seems like there was abuse that took place with this, to the point where it's not fully happening the way that it did at first, because people's hearts change. We get selfish, right? So that kind of messes everything up all the time. So the second thing is that they were doing this entirely voluntarily. Okay, so they were choosing to give and to provide for others, not that they were being compelled to do that by some authority. Third, this says nothing of the means of production. So they were giving of what they had. It doesn't say anything about someone controlling what they could do to earn money, which is usually when you start getting into the kind of communistic economic concepts. It's not only that everyone's sharing what they have, but that the government controls what people can do, things like that, to earn money. So there's nothing about the means of production in this. So this simply, the idea of trying to connect communism or socialism to Acts 2 and what the church was doing there at the beginning it's just not accurate. That it just wasn't what happened. This wasn't a national economic system. It wasn't forced. It was voluntary. It has nothing to do with the means of production. It was people voluntarily giving of what they had in order to provide for those in need. And as they did it, when they did it and they did it right, then it was wonderful, because it says that not only were they cared for, but that they had a great reputation around them for how they cared for the poor, and that affected people, and they were being saved because they would hear about what these Christians were doing. So that's good. It's just not an economic system, like a national economic system. So after all of this, we end up back where we began, right? Simply put, the Bible doesn't indicate that God establishes, or the Bible does, sorry, the Bible does indicate that God establishes governments for our benefit, but it doesn't endorse a specific kind or form of government. All governments should do what God has said to do, which is to punish the evil and to praise the good. But all governments are corrupt because people are corrupt. We're all sinners, right? And it seems like the level of corruption that you find in the government, there seems to be a connection there between that and people's love for God and how they follow God's ways. It's also clear that if we serve in the government, that we are to serve God and our fellow citizens in love, and that as citizens, then, if we're not in the government, but as citizens, we are to submit to the government, except where the government laws conflict with God's law. And again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. That's kind of the topic of the sermon for tomorrow. So I'm not going to get into that here today. Additionally, then, while economics is unavoidable, the Bible does not endorse any specific forms of economy. The Bible does tell us as Christians that we should deal fairly with one another, with others, not even just with one another, but even outside the church, that we should not steal, that we should help the poor, especially orphans and widows, that we should be generous, that we should work diligently as we are able to, and that as we care for one another in this way, in our generosity, that it's described at least of that having a beautiful impact on the community around, even leading people to Christ. But that's all about us and what we're supposed to do. But God, he didn't choose to reveal the best government or the best form of economy, if such things even exist. God chose to tell us how to act within whatever government or economic system we live. Right? He told us to love one another and to speak with gentleness and kindness towards one another. And that includes people who disagree with your political or economic ideas. And we're going to talk more about that on Monday. How do we deal with politics within the church? Just as importantly, God reminds us that this isn't our home. We are ultimately sojourners. We are travelers here in this world, in this place. And our home, our true citizenship, is with God. And it's with him for all of eternity in his kingdom. And so it's our desire, really, to see as many people enter that kingdom and join us in heaven, so much more so than to have our political ideas or economic ideas enforced here on earth. So I think that's a better perspective to keep, that ultimately we're citizens of heaven. We're citizens in God's kingdom. All right, that's it for today. I pray this has been a blessing for you. And again, if you're in the area, I invite you to come out and worship with us, either this Sunday or whatever Sunday you're able to come. And we meet at 11 a.m. Love to have you there. So go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'll see you in the next video.